Okay, so I just wanted to do a really quick video on the Wipeout games for the Sega Saturn. The Saturn has got some pretty significant third-party releases on it, and I'd say that the Wipeout games are pretty significant. They was pretty significant on the PlayStation, obviously, and I think when you think of the 32-bit generation, especially with the PlayStation, I think the Wipeout games are pretty iconic. Basically, I mean, I remember playing Wipeout on the PlayStation. I remember at the time I liked it, but it wasn't my cup of tea back then. Preferred stuff like Ridge Racer, V-Rally and stuff. But Wipeout did impress upon me, that whole futuristic racing kind of thing that I definitely never experienced it before. But what are the games like on the Sega Saturn? Well, starting off with Wipeout, the game hasn't got any transparencies in it, so the menus, not all of the menus were transparent in the PlayStation version, but there were like a few things. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think because I have looked into this, but it's been a while now. But I think the like the speed meter, I think that was transparent, but I think some of the other stuff wasn't. The very, very tiny light trails at the back of the well, they're not spaceships, at the back of the crafts. I mean, they are pretty small, but on the PlayStation they're transparent. On the Saturn they're not. And then on the PlayStation you had stuff like transparent fire effects, transparent explosions. But on the Sega Saturn, none of it's transparent. It's all, if anything, there's anything that could have been transparent is used dithering. So the very, very small light trails, I'm not sure whether they're dithered, but if they're not dithered, then they're just solid coloured polygons. They're not actually, nothing on the Saturn version is transparent, and a lot has been made about that, really. But the thing is, it doesn't really, the fact that there's no transparency on the Saturn version doesn't bear any hindrance on the game. The game doesn't look worse for not having it. It doesn't affect the game whatsoever, to be honest with you. It plays just as good as the PlayStation version. It doesn't have the music that the PlayStation version has, obviously, but it has got a good soundtrack. Playability wise, to be honest, I don't think, I mean, I found it really hard to play the PlayStation version. The first track is probably, well, no probably about it, for me it's the most playable track in the whole entire game. Even then it still has a few corners on it that you just think, oh, I don't know about this, and that carries over onto the Saturn version. On the Saturn version, the first track is still the best track, and all the rest, you can have this is a game where you're just going to be bouncing off the sides. And I talked about this in another video. As soon as you hit the sides, the craft virtually comes to a standstill. You lose all your speed, and you just constantly hitting the sides, and it just sucks all the fun out of it. Obviously, it's a game that you need to master, but for me, that's one of the reasons why probably back in the day, at least on the PlayStation version, I didn't really get into it. But the Saturn version has got everything that the playability wise and that the PlayStation version has got. It just hasn't got the stuff like transparency and the music, but not having those things doesn't take anything away from the game. It's still Wipeout. It's still everything you'd love in the game, in a Wipeout game. One of the problems I found with the gameplay is and I've really have thought about this, and I know you need to use the left and right shoulder buttons to really swing the craft around when you're hitting those corners. But after really thinking about this for some time, actually, there's two conclusions that I come to with the game, and this is, you can apply this to the PlayStation and Saturn version. It doesn't matter which version you play. The tracks are too small. They're not wide enough for the speed that your craft is going at and the tight corners that are in the game. And as well, that's another problem. The corners are really, really too tight on some of the levels. Sometimes you have like just like the sharpest corners, and I know you need to use those left and right shoulder buttons to swing the craft around. But when the track is too small at the same time, you're just going to bounce onto the sides of the tracks and virtually come to a standstill, basically. And yeah, so that's Wipeout anyway. Great game on the Saturn if you can get into the game at all, and it's just as good as the PlayStation version. So the other Saturn Wipeout game is Wipeout 2097. Now, I really love this game. It's a brilliant game. It's such a better game than the first Wipeout game. 2097 is just everything that the first Wipeout game should have been. And if anyone was to ask me, well, which Saturn Wipeout should I go for, 2097 is the definite one to go for. I know you can pick up Wipeout cheap as chips, but just give that game a miss and go for 2097. Trust me on this one. You will prefer, if you had both games, you definitely prefer 2097. Again, the Saturn version doesn't have any transparency, whereas the PlayStation version does. Again, there's a few things on the HUD and in the menus that are transparent in the PlayStation version, and then the light trails in the PlayStation version and in the Saturn version are really big, as opposed to Wipeout where they was really small. And in this you can really see that the PlayStation one is transparent and the Saturn one is vivid. Does it really make a difference that there's no transparency in the Saturn version at all anywhere in the game? No, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Again, the PlayStation version's got transparency and explosions, fire effects, and a lot of other things to boot, really. But again, the PlayStation, a big thing was made that the Saturn version didn't have those transparent effects in its version, really. But having played both versions and played the Saturn version quite a lot, it just makes absolutely no friggin' difference. It really doesn't. It just, the game on the Saturn looks brilliant and it doesn't need the transparent effects. Would the game look really nice with the transparent effects in there on the Saturn? Yeah, of course it would, but does it make any difference that they're not there? No, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. Again, the PlayStation version of 2097 had a stellar soundtrack. The Saturn one it's still got a great soundtrack, but obviously you ain't got those big names in the soundtrack. But it's still got a decent soundtrack, but obviously not as good as the PlayStation version. Gameplay wise, it's a great game. It's still just as good as the PlayStation version. And again, if you was to ask me which version to go for on the Saturn or on the PlayStation, really, I would just say 2097 all the way. Forget about the first Wipeout game. 2097 is the one that you're going to go for. I'll say this because it's just a superior game. It doesn't matter which console version you go for, it's just a superior game to its, the previous version. The tracks, the levels are better, and the tracks are wider in all the levels, and that means that at high speed, when you there are tight corners in some of the tracks, I'll admit that, but because the tracks are wider, you can swing yourself around, but without knowing that you're gonna every single time hit the side of the track and lose all your speed. So that's one bonus. It's like they thought to give you enough room to swing your vehicle around to get around a corner and keep your speed and momentum going, and therefore not lose your position in the race. The other thing that I really like about the game is that now you can graze like the barriers, at the side of the tracks. So whereas if you graze the barriers in the first game, you just come to a dead stop straight away, lose your speed, momentum, people whiz past you, and makes for a crappy experience really. But in 2097, if you just slightly was to graze a barrier, you just see these sparks come off your craft and you just keep on going. And I love that. I think that's brilliant. You don't come to a dead stop, you just see these sparks coming off. If you used to really smash into the barrier, then obviously you'd come to a dead stop and you'd lose a lot of momentum. But just having that thing, whereas if you graze it slightly, you keep your momentum. I think that's a brilliant move. But again, these are two great games on the Sega Saturn. Wipeout, if you can master it, then fair play. But I really would recommend 2097. I'd recommend 2097 even on the PlayStation as well. Both the games are top notch on the Saturn. People made a lot about the transparency not being present in the Saturn versions, but it makes absolutely no difference, believe me. Graphically, top notch on the Saturn. I wouldn't say the first Wipeout game is one that is a must-have for your Saturn collection really, but 2097 is definitely a game that you need for your Saturn collection really. And don't buy into all this crap that that both of the games are really inferior to the PlayStation counterparts, because they're not. They're lacking a few things here and there, transparency, the soundtracks, and maybe a few other elements, but by and large they're completely, gameplay wise and everything else, they're completely just as good as the PlayStation versions. So there you have it, guys. I mean, if you're going to go for a version, go for 2097. Brilliant games on the Saturn. 2097's one to go for, and yeah, just two great third party titles.